They said the house I inherited was worthless until my German shepherd found the hidden door inside the mountain. The day I turned 28 was supposed to be the first quiet birthday of my life after the war. I had no family, almost no money, only an old pickup, a worn backpack, and my German shepherd, Atlas. Then the director of the orphanage, where I had grown up, handed me a letter that had been waiting for 23 years. Inside was a map, a heavy iron key, and a note saying I had inherited a house deep in the Idaho mountains. I thought it would be nothing more than an abandoned cabin, but when Atlas started scratching at a stone wall inside the house, everything changed. The morning Caleb Walker turned 28 arrived quietly, the way most important days in his life seemed to. There was no celebration and no balloons. Only pale gray dawn slipping through the tall windows of the old orphanage in Idaho. Mrs. Hartley had called him back the week after his military discharge, saying only that something had waited long enough. The building had stood there longer than anyone could remember. Its wooden floors creaked with every step, and the walls carried the faint smell of dust, old books, and countless childhood memories. Caleb had grown up inside those walls. They were the closest thing he had ever known to a home. But he was only a visitor now, sleeping one final night in the narrow room he had occupied as a boy. At 18, the rules had been simple. You left. Caleb had walked out with the same worn backpack, enlisted, and spent the next decade moving through places far harsher than this quiet orphanage. Now he folded the few clothes he still owned and packed them again. The fabric was faded and torn along the seams, but it had survived everything, just like him. Across the small room, a large German shepherd lifted his head from the floor. Atlas. The dog watched Caleb carefully, ears alert, but eyes soft. Atlas had been at Caleb's side for almost 3 years. The German shepherd had served beside Caleb's unit during his last deployment overseas. After an attack left Atlas wounded and guarding a fallen handler, Caleb fought through months of paperwork to bring him home. 2 battered survivors had recognized something familiar in each other, and neither had been alone since. Now Atlas stood and walked over, pressing his nose gently against Caleb's hand. I know, Caleb murmured quietly. Atlas always seemed to know when something was changing. Caleb zipped the backpack and looked around the room one last time. The narrow bed, the cracked wooden dresser, the small window that looked out toward a line of pine trees swaying in the cold morning wind. 10 years after leaving, the circle had finally closed. The sound of a distant door opening echoed down the hallway. A moment later, a voice called softly. Caleb, could you come to my office for a moment? It was Mrs. Hartley, the orphanage director. Caleb grabbed the backpack and nodded toward Atlas. Come on, boy. The long hallway stretched ahead of them, lined with faded photographs of children who had passed through this place before him. Some of those children had been adopted. Others had simply disappeared into the world after turning 18. Caleb had expected to be one of the forgotten ones. Atlas padded quietly beside him, nails tapping softly against the wooden floor. When they reached the office door, Caleb knocked lightly. Come in, Mrs. Hartley said. Her office was small, but warm, filled with a scent of coffee and old paper. Sunlight streamed through the window behind her desk, casting a golden glow across stacks of folders and paperwork. Mrs. Hartley smiled when she saw him, though there was something thoughtful in her eyes. So, she said gently, 28 years old today, and back where it began. Caleb gave a small shrug. Your call made it sound important. She nodded slowly. It is. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Mrs. Hartley opened the bottom drawer of her desk and carefully pulled out something wrapped in brown paper. Dust floated into the air as she set it down in front of him. Caleb frowned. What's that? She slid the package across the desk. This arrived here many years ago, she said, and it's been waiting for you ever since. Caleb blinked in confusion. For me? Mrs. Hartley nodded. A lawyer delivered it when you were 5 years old. That made Caleb pause. 5? Yes, she said quietly. He gave very specific instructions. This envelope was not to be opened until your 28th birthday. Atlas shifted beside Caleb, sensing the change in the room. Caleb slowly unwrapped the brown paper. Inside was an old envelope, yellowed with age. His name was written across the front, in neat, steady handwriting. Caleb Walker. He stared at it for several seconds. I've never seen this handwriting before, he said. Mrs. Hartley shook her head. Neither have I. Caleb turned the envelope over in his hands. The paper felt stiff and fragile, like it had traveled through many years to reach this moment. Finally, he slid a finger under the flap and opened it. Inside were 3 things. First, a folded piece of paper. Second, a small metal key. And third, a map. The key caught his attention immediately. It was heavy, made of dark metal, and cold against his fingers. This doesn't look like a normal house key, Caleb said. Mrs. Hartley leaned forward slightly. What else is in there? Caleb unfolded the map. It showed a rough outline of mountains and narrow dirt roads. A red circle marked a location deep in a rugged part of the Sawtooth Mountains. He had heard of the area before. Miles of wilderness, dense forests, rocky cliffs, and hardly any towns. Then he unfolded the letter. The paper held only a single sentence. Caleb read it once, then again. If you are reading this, he said slowly, the house inside the mountain now belongs to you. Silence filled the room. Caleb looked up. A house inside a mountain? Mrs. Hartley spread her hands slightly. That's all we know. Caleb leaned back in the chair, trying to process the words. I don't have any family, he said quietly. Mrs. Hartley's expression softened. That's what we believe too. Atlas stepped closer, resting his head against Caleb's knee. The dog always sensed when Caleb's mind began racing. Caleb looked down at the map again. The red circle marked a place far from any town, just mountains, rivers, and wilderness. Do you think it's real? He asked. Mrs. Hartley smiled faintly. There was a lawyer involved. That usually means it is. Caleb folded the letter carefully. A house in a mountain, he murmured. The words sounded strange, even as he said them. He stood slowly, sliding the key and map back into the envelope. Well, he said quietly, I guess I should go see it. Mrs. Hartley stood and walked around the desk. She placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. You've always been stronger than you realize, Caleb. Atlas wagged his tail once, as if agreeing. Caleb managed a small smile. Yeah, he said softly. Then he looked down at the envelope again. For 23 years, someone had waited for him to open it. And now, whatever waited in those mountains was his. Outside the orphanage, the wind rustled through the tall pine trees. Caleb stepped into the cool morning air with Atlas beside him. The world ahead was wide, empty, and uncertain. But somewhere in the distant mountains, a house was waiting. And neither Caleb nor Atlas had any idea that the moment they found it, everything in their lives would change. The road out of the orphanage stretched ahead in a quiet ribbon of cracked asphalt. Caleb drove slowly, one hand resting on the steering wheel of the old pickup truck he had bought with his last military paycheck. The truck wasn't much to look at. Its paint faded, its engine rumbling like a tired animal. But it ran, and for now, that was enough. Atlas sat upright in the passenger seat, watching the passing trees through the open window. The wind carried the scent of pine and cold mountain air into the cab. Caleb hadn't realized how long it had been since he had driven through a place this quiet. No sirens, no shouting, no distant echoes that sounded too much like explosions. Just wind through the trees. For a while, neither of them moved. Then, Atlas shifted slightly, placing one paw gently against Caleb's leg. Caleb glanced down and gave a faint smile. "Yeah," he murmured. "I know." Atlas always knew. The dog had learned to recognize the signs before Caleb himself even noticed them. The tightening of his shoulders, the way his breathing changed, the distant look in his eyes, when old memories began creeping back. Memories Caleb couldn't always control. The kind that came without warning. Like the one that flickered suddenly through his mind now. A dusty checkpoint in another country. Heat rising off the sand. The distant crack of gunfire. Caleb's grip on the steering wheel tightened. Atlas leaned closer. The pressure of the dog's weight grounded him immediately. Caleb exhaled slowly and focused on the road again. "Not today," he said quietly. Atlas rested his head against Caleb's arm. The moment passed. Miles of open highway slipped beneath the tires as the truck pushed deeper into Idaho's wilderness. Small towns appeared and disappeared along the route. Clusters of gas stations, diners, and weathered houses that looked like they had been standing for generations. But Caleb kept driving, deeper into Idaho, deeper into the mountains. The map from the envelope sat folded on the dashboard. Every now and then Caleb glanced at the red circle drawn in the center. Sawtooth Mountains. Even the name sounded rugged. By late afternoon, the highway narrowed into a winding mountain road. The trees grew taller there, thick pine forests covering the slopes like a dark green blanket. Snow still clung to the highest peaks, glowing pale against the deep blue sky. The world felt different here. Older, quieter. Atlas suddenly lifted his head. His ears twitched. Caleb noticed the change immediately. "What is it?" The dog stared out the windshield alert. But after a moment, Atlas relaxed again. Probably just wildlife somewhere in the forest. Caleb followed the map's directions carefully. Eventually, the paved road ended entirely, replaced by a narrow dirt path that wound its way along the edge of a steep valley. The truck rattled over loose gravel. Dust rose behind them in a thin cloud. For nearly an hour, they drove without seeing another vehicle. No houses, no power lines, nothing but mountains. Caleb began to wonder if the map was wrong. Then the path curved sharply around a tall rock formation, and suddenly the forest opened. Before them stretched a wide valley, surrounded by towering ridges of jagged stone. Pine trees covered the lower slopes, while the upper cliffs stood bare and rugged against the sky. The place looked untouched and wild. At the far end of the valley, small ranches dotted the landscape. Clusters of barns and wooden houses sat beside narrow strips of farmland. Caleb slowed the truck. He could see cattle grazing in the distance. Thin streams of water cut across the fields, reflecting sunlight like silver ribbons. So people did live out there, just not many. Atlas stood up in the seat, nose pressed against the glass as he studied the valley. Caleb followed the map again. Before taking the road uphill, he stopped at the valley's only general store to fill the truck's spare fuel can and confirm the route. Two ranch hands near the porch noticed the old map in his hand. When Caleb mentioned the house built into the mountain, one of them laughed. "That place?" the man said. "It's barely a house. No power, no proper road, and nothing but rock behind it. Whoever left it to you didn't leave you much." The second man shook his head and called it a stone coffin with a porch. Atlas stood quietly beside Caleb, watching them with the patient stare of an animal who had already learned that loud voices rarely carried much wisdom. Only an older rancher near the door remained serious. "People used to call the man up there the keeper," the older rancher said. "Nobody knew what he kept. But the wells have been dropping for years. And strange things happen whenever trucks from East Valley Ranch start working near the old pipelines." The laughter faded for a moment. Caleb thanked the man, returned to his pickup, and continued toward the ridge. Behind him, one of the ranch hands called, "Don't expect that mountain to make you rich." Caleb did not answer. Atlas looked back once, then faced the road ahead. The red circle wasn't down in the valley. It was higher, up in the mountains. Another narrow road branched off the dirt path, climbing steeply toward the rocky cliffs above. Caleb turned the truck onto it. The engine groaned slightly as the vehicle began its slow climb. The road became rougher the higher they went. Stones clattered beneath the tires. Tall grass brushed against the sides of the truck. Eventually, the trees thinned out. Bare rock replaced soil. The air grew cooler. Then, after one final bend in the road, Atlas suddenly barked. Caleb slammed the brakes. The truck rolled to a stop. "What is it, boy?" Atlas was staring straight ahead. Caleb followed his gaze. "What is it, boy?" Caleb. Caleb slammed the brakes. At first, he didn't understand what he was seeing. The rocky cliff in front of them looked like any other part of the mountain until he noticed the shape. A roofline, windows, and a wooden front porch. The structure blended so perfectly with the stone behind it that it nearly disappeared into the mountain itself. Half the house looked ordinary. The other half seemed carved directly into the rock. Caleb stepped out of the truck slowly. The mountain wind brushed against his jacket as he walked closer. Atlas jumped down beside him, sniffing the ground carefully. The house stood silent. There was no smoke from the chimney and no light in the windows, only weathered wood and stone. Caleb approached the door. The wood was old, but solid. Dust covered the porch. No footprints, no tire tracks, except his own. "It's real," Caleb whispered. Atlas sniffed along the base of the wall, tail moving slowly. Caleb pulled the metal key from his pocket. It felt heavier now than it had that morning. For 23 years, this key had been waiting. And now, it was finally here. Caleb inserted it into the lock. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, click. The door creaked open. A breath of cool, stale air drifted out from inside. Caleb stepped through the doorway. The first room was simple. A wooden table, a narrow bed against the wall, and shelves filled with old books. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, but nothing looked broken. It felt like someone had once lived here and simply never come back. Atlas walked slowly across the floor, nose close to the ground. Then the dog froze. His body stiffened, ears forward. A low growl rumbled deep in his chest. Caleb immediately recognized the sound. It was the same warning Atlas used during patrols overseas. The dog wasn't afraid. He had found something. Atlas moved toward the back wall of the house. The wall was not wood. It was stone. Atlas sniffed along the edge, then began scratching hard at the rock, claws scraping against the surface. "Hey, easy," Caleb said, but Atlas didn't stop. He kept digging at a specific spot near the floor. Dust and small rocks fell away. Caleb crouched beside him. At first, he saw nothing. Then his fingers brushed against something cold beneath the dirt. Metal. Caleb cleared more debris away. Slowly, the outline of something appeared in the stone. A door. Not wood, but steel. Old. hidden. Caleb stared at it, his heartbeat quickening. Atlas sat back on his haunches, watching him. The dog's eyes were calm, certain. Caleb ran a hand across the metal surface. "What did you find, Atlas?" The steel door sat perfectly flush with the rock wall, nearly impossible to see unless you knew exactly where to look. A small keyhole waited near the center. Caleb slowly reached into his pocket again. The heavy metal key rested in his palm. For a long moment, he simply stared at it. Then, he looked back at Atlas. "Well," he said quietly, "let's see what's behind it." The steel key felt cold and heavy in Caleb's hand as he knelt beside the hidden door. The mountain air, drifting through the open front door, carried the faint scent of pine and dust. But here, near the stone wall, the air smelled older, damp and metallic, like a place that had not been touched in decades. Atlas stood close, watching every movement Caleb made. The dog's posture was different now. Alert, focused. Caleb slid the key slowly toward the narrow keyhole in the center of the steel door. For a moment, he hesitated. Something about this felt bigger than simply opening an old lock, like stepping across a line you couldn't step back from. Atlas let out a soft huff, as if reminding him to keep moving. Caleb pushed the key in. The metal scraped faintly inside the lock. Then he turned it. At first, nothing happened. Then, deep inside the door, something shifted. A heavy clank echoed through the stone wall. Dust trembled loose from the edges of the frame. Caleb pulled the handle carefully. The steel door resisted at first, stuck from years of disuse. He braced his foot against the wall and pulled harder. With a long groan of rusted hinges, the door finally gave way. Cold air rushed out from the darkness beyond. It smelled like underground stone and still water. Caleb grabbed the flashlight from his backpack and clicked it on. A narrow beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing a passageway carved directly into the mountain. The tunnel sloped downward slightly. The walls were not natural rock. They had been shaped and smoothed. Someone had carved this place deliberately. "Well," Caleb muttered under his breath, "that's not normal." Atlas stepped forward immediately, nose low, tail steady. The dog moved into the tunnel without hesitation. Caleb followed. The sound of their footsteps echoed softly against the stone walls as they moved deeper inside the mountain. The air grew cooler with every step. Somewhere far ahead, Caleb thought he could hear the faint drip of water. The beam of the flashlight revealed something else along the walls. Metal pipes. Thick, iron lines ran along both sides of the tunnel, disappearing into the stone ceiling and floor-like veins inside the mountain. Caleb crouched beside one of them and brushed away dust with his hand. The metal was old, but solid. He had seen equipment like this before during his time in the military, old infrastructure systems buried underground to survive storms and disasters. But this was much larger. Atlas stopped suddenly. His ears perked up. Caleb raised the flashlight. The tunnel widened ahead. They stepped through the opening. Caleb froze. The beam of the flashlight swept across a vast underground chamber. The chamber was enormous, stretching across the mountain interior like the hidden heart of some forgotten machine. Towering metal tanks stood along the walls, connected by thick pipes and heavy valves. Steel platforms and ladders climbed upward into darkness. In the center of the chamber stood a long metal control station covered with switches, levers, and dusty glass screens. Caleb slowly lowered the flashlight. What in the world? Atlas walked forward cautiously, his nails clicking against the concrete floor. The dog sniffed the air, then circled the control station once before sitting beside Caleb. The place felt strange. Not abandoned, exactly. Just asleep. Caleb stepped closer to the control panel. His fingers brushed against one of the switches, leaving a clean streak through the dust. He wiped more of it away. Letters slowly appeared beneath the grime. Valley Water Regulation System. Caleb read the words again. Water regulation? He turned and shined the flashlight across the chamber. Now that he looked closer, the pipes made more sense. Hundreds of them ran through the walls like a massive underground network. Water lines. Big ones. Caleb walked toward one of the tall metal tanks and tapped the side with his knuckle. The hollow sound echoed through the chamber. Reservoir, he murmured. Atlas suddenly stood again. The dog's nose lifted slightly, as if he smelled something new. Caleb followed his gaze. Near the back wall of the chamber sat a wooden desk. Unlike everything else in the room, the desk looked almost ordinary. A single metal lamp sat on top, beside a stack of thick notebooks covered in dust. Caleb walked over. The chair creaked as he pulled it back and sat down. Atlas settled beside him. Caleb opened the first notebook carefully. The pages were yellowed, but still readable. At the top of the first page were 3 handwritten words. Keeper's log. Caleb frowned. He flipped to the next page. The handwriting was neat and steady. This mountain system was built in 1947 to manage the underground water sources feeding the valley below. The springs inside the mountain provide enough water to sustain every farm and town in the region year-round. Caleb leaned back slowly. Every farm. He flipped another page. Without regulation, the strongest landowners would draw more water than others. The system had been built to ensure balance. Caleb stared at the pipes surrounding the chamber. So this whole place controls the valley's water. He flipped another page. Atlas thumped his tail once against the floor. Caleb continued reading. The keeper lives in the house above. His duty is simple. Monitor the flow, maintain the balance, and protect the system from those who would exploit it. Caleb sat silently for a long moment. One word echoed in his mind. Keeper. Atlas rested his head on Caleb's knee. You hear that? Caleb said quietly. I think we just found out what this place is. Caleb flipped to the final pages of the notebook. The handwriting changed slightly there, more hurried, less steady. If you are reading this, then I am gone. Caleb's chest tightened slightly. I had no family to leave this duty to. The valley will always need someone who understands what it means to have nothing. Caleb stopped reading. The sentence hung in the air. Atlas lifted his head slightly. Caleb slowly read the last line aloud. That is why the mountain house has been left to the orphan. The flashlight beam trembled slightly in Caleb's hand. He sat back in the chair, staring across the vast underground system. An orphan. That was him. Someone had chosen him. Not because he was powerful, not because he was wealthy, but because he knew what it felt like to live without a place in the world. Atlas nudged his hand gently. Caleb exhaled slowly. Well, Atlas, he said quietly, looks like we just inherited a lot more than a house. The dog looked up at him calmly. Then suddenly, a low humming sound filled the chamber. Caleb stiffened. The control panel lights flickered weakly. Dust fell from one of the pipes overhead. Somewhere deep inside the mountain, something mechanical shifted. The system was waking up. A low vibration moved through the concrete floor beneath Caleb's boots. It wasn't loud, but it was steady, like the deep heartbeat of something enormous buried beneath the rock. Atlas rose immediately. The German shepherd's ears snapped forward as he scanned the cavern, muscles tight, every instinct alert. Caleb slowly stood from the chair beside the desk. The control panel lights flickered again. One of the dusty screens on the console blinked faintly to life. Caleb stepped closer, brushing dust away with his sleeve. The glass revealed a dim map slowly forming on the screen. Thin, glowing lines spreading across the dark display, like roots beneath the earth. Pipes. Hundreds of them. They stretched across the entire valley Caleb had seen earlier from the mountain road. Fields, ranches, streams. Every water line feeding them ran through this mountain. "Well," Caleb said quietly. Atlas looked up at him. "I think we just found the reason this place exists." Another sound echoed through the chamber. This time, it was louder. A deep metallic groan rolled through the walls as old valves, somewhere far below, slowly turned for the first time in years. Dust drifted down from the ceiling beams. Caleb watched the screen. Words slowly appeared across the flickering monitor. "System. Initialization." He blinked. "You've got to be kidding me." Atlas stepped closer to the console, sniffing the metal surface as if the dog could sense the machine's awakening. The map on the screen sharpened. Blue lines glowed across most of the valley, but one section was flashing red. Caleb leaned closer. "What does that mean?" He searched the control panel for more information. Several metal switches sat beneath the screen, each labeled with faded lettering. Reservoir levels, flow control, distribution balance. The words sounded more like engineering terms than anything Caleb understood, but one small indicator light kept blinking beside the red section of the map. Alert. Caleb pressed the nearby button. The screen flickered again. Then new words appeared. Unauthorized extraction detected. Caleb frowned. Extraction? Atlas let out a soft growl. Caleb followed the dog's gaze toward the screen again. The map zoomed in automatically. The red area sat on the far side of the valley. A large property appeared in the center of the display. Buildings, fences, wide irrigation lines stretching across acres of land. Caleb recognized it instantly. He had seen the ranch earlier when he drove into the valley. It had been the biggest one by far. More lines of text appeared on the screen. Water diversion pumps active. Distribution imbalance detected. Caleb rubbed the back of his neck slowly. "Okay. I don't know much about irrigation systems," he muttered. "But that doesn't sound good." Atlas continued watching the screen. The dog's low growl deepened. Caleb opened the keeper's notebook again, flipping quickly through the pages. The handwriting grew more urgent in later entries. He scanned the text until one paragraph caught his attention. "If the system ever shows an extraction imbalance, it means someone in the valley has found a way to divert water before it reaches the natural distribution points." Caleb read the sentence again, then slowly looked back at the glowing red section of the map. "So someone's stealing it." Atlas's tail flicked once. The dog seemed to agree. Caleb continued reading. "In the early years, this happened often. Wealthy landowners tried to take more water than others. The keeper must correct the imbalance whenever it occurs." Caleb flipped another page. "There is a lever on the main console labeled Flow Balance. Pulling it will restore equal distribution across the valley." Caleb looked up. Sure enough, near the bottom of the control station sat a thick metal lever. The label beneath it read Flow Balance. Atlas nudged Caleb's arm gently. Caleb sighed. "Yeah, I see it, too." He glanced back toward the screen. The East Valley Ranch property continued flashing. Every few seconds, the warning light blinked brighter. Unauthorized extraction. Caleb imagined the farmers he had seen earlier in the valley. Small ranches, modest homes, families depending on their wells and irrigation lines to survive. If someone upstream had found a way to divert water before it reached the rest of the valley, those farms would slowly dry up. Caleb had seen enough places in the world where powerful people took what they wanted and left everyone else with nothing. He clenched his jaw. "Not exactly subtle, are they?" Atlas stepped closer to the lever. The dog looked from Caleb to the console and back again, as if asking what the plan was. Caleb placed his hand on the cold metal handle. For a moment, he didn't move. Aldi, he thought about the words in the journal. The keeper must correct the imbalance. Atlas waited silently beside him. Caleb took a slow breath. Then he pulled the lever. The reaction was immediate. A thunderous rush echoed through the chamber as massive valves deep inside the mountain snapped open. Water surged through the pipes with a roaring sound that vibrated through the walls. Atlas stepped back slightly, startled, but steady. On the screen, the glowing blue lines across the valley began shifting. New channels lit up. Water rerouted. The red ranch still flashed for a moment. Then its pipelines dimmed. The system displayed a new message. Flow redistribution active. Caleb exhaled slowly. "Well," he said, "looks like that worked." But before he could relax, another alert flashed across the monitor. External monitoring triggered. Caleb frowned. "What does that mean?" The map zoomed out. A new symbol appeared on the valley road, a small moving icon. Vehicle detected. The symbol crawled slowly up the mountain road, heading directly toward the house above them. Atlas growled. Caleb stared at the screen. Then he glanced toward the tunnel, leading back up to the house. "Someone noticed," he said quietly. The vehicle icon continued climbing the mountain path. Whoever had been stealing the valley's water had realized that someone had turned the system back on, and now they were coming to find out who. Caleb stared at the blinking symbol on the old monitor. The small symbol crept slowly up the thin road carved into the mountainside. Every few seconds it moved closer to the house above them, closer to him. Atlas stood rigid beside the control panel, staring toward the tunnel that led back to the surface. His ears were forward now, his body tense in a way Caleb had seen many times before. Not fear, readiness. Caleb rubbed a hand across his jaw. "Well," he said quietly, "guess we just made someone very unhappy." The machine hummed steadily behind him. The pipes lining the walls vibrated softly as water rushed through them, redistributing itself across the valley below. The screen still displayed the map. Most of the valley glowed calm blue now, but the large ranch on the eastern side continued to flicker with warning lights. Caleb leaned closer. Words appeared beneath the property's outline. Property owner Douglas Mercer. Caleb exhaled slowly. So that's his name. He opened the keeper's notebook again, flipping through the final pages. More carefully. This time, several entries mentioned the same name, Mercer. The handwriting had grown rougher in those entries, as if the writer had been frustrated. Douglas Mercer purchased the old East Valley Ranch 5 years ago, one note read. Since then, he has been attempting to gain access to the mountain system. Caleb frowned. He knew about this place? Atlas gave a low rumble in his chest. Caleb continued reading. He has installed unauthorized pumps along the lower pipeline routes. I have disabled them twice. Each time, he builds new ones farther upstream. Caleb shook his head. So, he's been stealing the water for years. Another line in the journal made Caleb pause. If Mercer ever gains control of the system, the valley will belong to him. Caleb looked back at the screen. The vehicle icon was still climbing the mountain road. Slowly, steadily, like a predator, following a scent. Caleb closed the notebook. Well, Atlas, he said quietly. Sounds like we just interrupted someone's business. Atlas paced toward the tunnel entrance, sniffing the air. Caleb glanced around the underground chamber again. Now that the system was active, faint lights had come alive across several panels. The room felt less like an abandoned relic, and more like a sleeping giant that had finally awakened. Somewhere, deep inside the pipes, water thundered through the mountain. Caleb imagined the streams and irrigation lines far below suddenly filling again. Fields that had been dry for weeks now receiving water. Farmers turning their faucets and finding pressure where there had been none. He felt a strange sense of satisfaction. Then the screen beeped again. The vehicle icon had stopped. Caleb leaned closer. It had reached the base of the hill beneath the house. A small camera symbol blinked on the map. Another screen flickered on beside the control panel. A grainy black and white image appeared. The view showed the dusty clearing in front of the mountain house. A pickup truck rolled into the frame. Caleb felt Atlas step closer beside him. The truck stopped. The driver's door opened. A tall man climbed out. Even through the old camera's grainy image, Caleb could see the confidence in the way the man moved. He wore dark jeans and a leather jacket, despite the mountain wind. The man removed a pair of sunglasses and scanned the area. Douglas Mercer. Caleb watched him carefully. Mercer looked like someone who had spent his life getting exactly what he wanted, and right now, he looked very interested in the mountain house. Atlas growled softly. Caleb reached down and rested a hand on the dog's neck. Easy. Mercer walked slowly toward the front door of the house. His boots crunched across the gravel. On the screen, Caleb could see Mercer pause near the porch steps. The man studied the door for a moment. Then he looked up at the mountain, as if he knew something lay beneath it. Caleb's stomach tightened. He knows, he whispered. Atlas's growl deepened slightly. Mercer stepped onto the porch. He knocked on the door. The sound echoed faintly through the mountain tunnel above them. Caleb froze. The knock came again, louder this time. "Hello?" A voice called from outside. The microphone on the camera picked up Mercer's voice clearly. "I know someone's here." Caleb and Atlas exchanged a silent look. Mercer knocked again, harder. "Doors open," he called. "No point hiding." Caleb glanced back at the control panel. The screen still displayed the valley map, blue water lines spreading evenly across the land. But beneath them, another message now blinked softly. External monitoring alert. Caleb sighed. Guess the mountain doesn't like secrets. Atlas stepped closer to the tunnel entrance again. The dog's nose twitched. Caleb knew that look. Atlas could hear Mercer moving above them. Boots shifting on the porch. The door creaked open. Mercer stepped inside the house. The camera showed him scanning the room carefully. His eyes moved across the dusty table, the empty bed, the open steel door hidden behind the stone wall. Mercer smiled slightly. "There you are." He stepped toward the tunnel entrance. Caleb felt his heartbeat quicken. Atlas stood ready. Mercer leaned toward the opening in the stone wall and called down into the darkness. "You might as well come out," he said calmly. "I've been looking for this place a long time." The sound of Mercer's voice echoed down the tunnel. Caleb remained perfectly still. Atlas's muscles were tight as coiled steel. Mercer waited. Then he spoke again. "You turn the water back on," he said. His tone was calm, but there was anger beneath it. Caleb looked at the glowing map. One more time. The valley water system was flowing again. The farms below were safe for now, but the man who had been stealing it was standing directly above them, waiting. And judging by the quiet confidence in Mercer's voice, he wasn't planning to leave empty-handed. The tunnel held the sound of his voice long after he stopped speaking. Caleb stood in the control room with one hand resting on the cold metal edge of the console. Above them, the house creaked softly as wind pushed against the wooden walls. Atlas didn't move. The German shepherd's ears were angled forward toward the tunnel entrance, listening, waiting. From somewhere above came the slow sound of footsteps crossing the floorboards. Mercer was inside the house now. Caleb's chest tightened. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was the kind of pressure that built inside his lungs before a firefight. A quiet warning in the body that something dangerous was approaching. He swallowed slowly. "All right," Caleb murmured. Atlas glanced up at him. "Let's think." Caleb looked back toward the glowing map. Water still flowed across the valley through the underground pipes. The system hummed steadily now, alive and working again after years of silence. but the blinking warning light remained on the screen. External presence detected. Atlas's growl deepened. Above them, Mercer's footsteps moved closer to the hidden steel door. The sound echoed down the tunnel, each step slow, patient, like a hunter who already knew where his prey was hiding. Caleb's fingers curled slightly around the edge of the console. Then, a sharp slam echoed through the mountain. Mercer had kicked the steel door open. The sudden crash reverberated through the tunnel. And in that instant, something inside Caleb's mind snapped. The sound wasn't just a door anymore. It was a memory. A metal blast door slamming shut in a concrete bunker overseas. A shout, the crack of gunfire. Dust exploding off a wall. Caleb's breathing suddenly sped up. His vision blurred for a moment. Atlas reacted instantly. The dog turned and pressed firmly against Caleb's leg. Caleb squeezed his eyes shut. No. No. The tunnel seemed to spin slightly around him. Another sound echoed from above. Mercer's boots stepping onto the metal floor of the tunnel entrance. The metallic clang of his steps bounced sharply down the stone passage. Caleb's pulse thundered in his ears. The old memories pushed forward harder now. Flashes of heat, sand, smoke. Atlas nudged Caleb's hand firmly with his nose. Caleb felt the pressure, but couldn't quite focus. His breathing became short and uneven. The chamber lights seemed too bright suddenly, too loud. Atlas moved closer. The dog pushed his body against Caleb's legs and leaned upward, pressing his head against Caleb's chest. A familiar weight, a steady warmth. Caleb opened his eyes. Atlas stared back at him. The dog didn't bark, didn't move. He simply held Caleb there, grounding him in the moment. Caleb focused on the steady rhythm of Atlas's breathing. In, out, in, out. The noise of the tunnel faded slightly. The rushing water in the pipes became clearer. The room steadied around him. Caleb inhaled deeply, then exhaled slowly. "Good boy," he whispered hoarsely. Atlas wagged his tail once. Above them, Mercer's voice drifted down the tunnel again. "You know," Mercer called calmly, "I was beginning to think this place was a myth." His footsteps began descending the tunnel now. One step, then another. Caleb straightened slowly. The worst of the panic had passed, but the adrenaline remained. He glanced back at the control panel. "Okay," he murmured quietly. Atlas stepped forward beside him. Caleb quickly scanned the console again. The keeper's notebook lay open beside the screens. He flipped through the final pages rapidly. Most of the entries described the system's water distribution and maintenance routines, but one section was marked with a bold underline. Emergency protocol. Caleb leaned closer. If the system is threatened by someone attempting to seize control of the valley's water. He paused. Atlas's ears twitched. Mercer's boots continued echoing down the tunnel. Closer. Caleb kept reading. The keeper must activate the mountain lock. Caleb frowned. What's that? He searched the console. Then he saw it. Near the far edge of the control panel sat another large metal lever. It was protected by a small steel cover. The label beneath it read, "Mountain Lock." Caleb stared at it. Ho, ho, hoo-hoo, 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 hoo-hoo. He flipped the page again. If activated, the mountain lock permanently seals the control system. Caleb's stomach tightened. He read the next line slowly. The water will continue flowing naturally through the underground springs. But no person will ever control the distribution again. Caleb looked up from the notebook. Ever. Atlas shifted beside him. Mercer's footsteps were halfway down the tunnel now. Slow, steady, The man wasn't rushing. He didn't need to. Caleb glanced back at the map. The valley's farms still glowed blue across the screen. Water flowing again. Fields saved. For now. But if Mercer reached this console, everything could change. Mercer's voice echoed again. You know, he said casually, you could save us both a lot of trouble. And just come say hello. Caleb remained silent. Atlas's growl deepened slightly. The footsteps moved closer. Caleb looked down at the mountain lock lever again. If he pulled it, the system would seal. Forever. No one, not Mercer, not Caleb, would ever control the valley's water again. The mountain would simply release it naturally. Equal. Untouchable. But the keeper's notebook had warned of something else. Once activated, the lock could never be undone. Caleb exhaled slowly. Big decision, he muttered. Atlas looked up at him. Mercer's silhouette appeared at the far end of the tunnel, a tall shadow moving through the dim light. Caleb could now see the man clearly. Douglas Mercer stepped into the chamber with calm confidence. His eyes immediately scanned the massive room. Then they landed on Caleb and the control system behind him. Mercer smiled. Well, he said. So, the mountain finally found a new keeper. Douglas Mercer's voice carried calmly across the chamber, echoing off the concrete walls and steel tanks. The hum of water moving through the pipes filled the silence between his words. Caleb didn't answer right away. He studied the man standing at the end of the tunnel. Mercer was taller than Caleb expected. Broad shoulders, gray beginning to creep into his dark hair. His jacket looked expensive even under the dust of the mountain trail. But what Caleb noticed most were the eyes. Mercer looked at the control room, the way a man looks at something he believes already belongs to him. Atlas stepped slightly in front of Caleb. The German shepherd's low growl rolled through the chamber like distant thunder. Mercer glanced down at the dog. Well now, he said mildly, that's a fine animal. Atlas didn't move. Mercer's gaze returned to Caleb. You must be Caleb Walker. Caleb felt a chill move down his spine. You've been doing your homework, he said quietly. Mercer smiled. Hard not to when someone turns on a system that's been asleep for 10 years. He walked slowly across the floor, boots echoing with every step. Atlas's growl grew louder. Mercer stopped about 20 feet from the control console. His eyes moved across the glowing screens, across the rushing pipes, across the map of the valley. Then he nodded slowly. So it's real after all. Caleb leaned one hand casually against the console. You knew about this place. Mercer chuckled softly. Oh, I've known about it for a long time. His eyes flicked toward the keeper's notebook, lying open on the desk. That old fool who lived here before you was very protective of his little secret. Caleb's jaw tightened. You mean the man who built the system that keeps the valley alive? Mercer shrugged. I mean the man who stood in the way of progress. Atlas took a step forward. Mercer glanced down again. The dog's teeth were visible now. Mercer lifted his hands slightly, in mock surrender. Easy there. Then he looked back at Caleb. You see, Caleb, Mercer said, water is the most valuable thing in this valley. He nodded toward the glowing map. Every ranch, every field, every cow out there survives because of what's flowing through these pipes. Caleb said nothing. Mercer's voice grew quieter. And whoever controls the water controls everything. Atlas barked sharply. Mercer smirked. Your dog seems to understand the situation. Caleb straightened slowly. And you think that person should be you? Mercer smiled again. Well, someone has to manage things properly. He stepped closer. Let's not pretend those little farms down there know what they're doing. He pointed toward the screen. Half of them waste water. like it grows on trees. Caleb felt anger rise in his chest. They're trying to survive. Mercer shrugged. So am I. The words hung in the air for a moment. Then Mercer's tone changed slightly. But the truth is, Caleb, this situation doesn't have to be complicated. He nodded toward the console. You clearly figured out how to turn the system back on. Caleb didn't move. But Mercer spread his hands calmly. Which means you can also give it to me. Atlas growled again. Mercer sighed. Look, I'm not an unreasonable man. He stepped even closer now, his voice almost friendly. You're new here. You don't know the valley. He gestured toward the tunnels. You don't know how complicated this system is. Caleb watched him carefully. Mercer leaned against one of the metal tanks. But I do. His voice lowered. And if you help me, I'll make sure you're taken care of. Caleb frowned. What does that mean? Mercer's smile widened. I mean, you'll never worry about money again. Atlas barked once. Mercer ignored him. You're an orphan, right? He continued. No family. Caleb felt his stomach tighten. So what? Mercer shrugged. That means nobody's depending on you. He tapped the control panel lightly. But this system, this is a fortune waiting to be used properly. Caleb's eyes hardened. You mean controlled? Mercer nodded. Exactly. The water pipes roared softly behind them. Caleb glanced back at the map. The farms in the valley still glowed blue, water flowing again. Mercer noticed his glance. Temporary, he said calmly. Caleb looked back at him. What's that supposed to mean? Mercer smiled. You pulled the flow lever. Caleb didn't respond. Mercer pointed at the system. But the pumps I installed down there, he chuckled. They'll be back online within a day. Atlas growled louder. Mercer continued. You see, if you give me access to the system, I can make sure everything runs smoothly. He stepped forward one more time. Everybody wins. Caleb stared at him. And if I don't? Mercer's smile faded. The chamber grew very quiet. The water rushing through the pipes sounded louder now. Mercer's eyes hardened slightly. Well, he said slowly, then we'll have a problem. Atlas stepped forward again. Mercer's gaze dropped to the dog. Careful, he said calmly. Caleb's voice was steady. You planning to threaten me? Mercer shook his head. No, he nodded toward the tunnel. I'm simply pointing out that you're very alone up here. Caleb followed his gaze briefly. The tunnel stretched back toward the house above. Empty. Silent. Mercer spread his hands. And accidents happen in the mountains. All the time. Atlas's teeth showed fully now. Mercer sighed again. Look, let's stop pretending this is some heroic moment. He nodded toward the console. You've got something valuable. His eyes locked onto Caleb's. And I'm here to collect it. The mountain hummed around them. The control screens continued glowing quietly. Atlas stood between the two men like a living wall. Caleb slowly placed his hand on the metal cover, protecting the lever beside the console. The one labeled Mountain Lock. Mercer's eyes narrowed slightly. What's that? Caleb didn't answer, but inside his mind, a decision was beginning to form. Caleb kept his hand resting on the metal cover of the lever. The steel felt cold beneath his palm. The words engraved on the console beneath it seemed heavier than before. Mountain Lock. The humming of the system filled the chamber like a deep, mechanical heartbeat. Water rushed through the pipes surrounding them, feeding the valley below. Atlas remained planted between Caleb and Mercer, shoulders squared, eyes locked on the man. Mercer noticed Caleb's hand on the lever. His expression shifted slightly. What exactly is that? He asked. Caleb didn't answer immediately. Instead, he slowly lifted the metal cover, protecting the switch. The hinge creaked softly. Mercer straightened. "Hold on," he said. The calm confidence in his voice had changed. "What does that lever do?" Caleb glanced toward the keeper's notebook lying open beside the console. Then he looked back at Mercer. "It ends the conversation," he said quietly. Mercer's eyes narrowed. "You don't even know how this system works." Caleb shook his head slightly. "Not completely." He nodded toward the notebook. "But I know enough." Atlas growled softly. Mercer took a step closer. "Let's think about this," he said. His voice was still calm, but there was tension behind it now. "You pull some random lever in here, and you could shut down the entire valley." Caleb looked past him toward the glowing map. Blue lines stretched across the farmland below, water flowing again, fields alive again. The image reminded him of the drive through the valley earlier. Small houses, old barns, families trying to make a living in hard land. Then he remembered the warning in the notebook. If Mercer ever gains control of the system, the valley will belong to him. Caleb's grip tightened slightly. Mercer noticed. "Listen," Mercer said quickly. "You're not thinking this through." He pointed toward the screen. "That system is worth millions." Caleb remained silent. Mercer's voice grew sharper. "You could run the entire valley from here." Caleb looked back at him. "And you want it?" Mercer didn't deny it. "Of course I do." He spread his hands. "That's how the world works." Atlas barked once. Mercer ignored the dog. Power belongs to the people, smart enough to use it. Caleb let out a slow breath. The mountain air in and chamber felt heavy now. The sound of water rushing through the pipe seemed louder than before. Mercer stepped closer again. "Look," he said. "I'm giving you a chance here." Caleb tilted his head slightly. "A chance?" Mercer nodded. "You help me run the system." He pointed toward the map. "You and me." Caleb raised an eyebrow. "You're offering me a partnership." Mercer smiled. "Exactly." Caleb looked down at Atlas. The dog's ears twitched slightly, as if listening to the conversation. Caleb scratched the back of Atlas's neck gently. Then he looked back at Mercer. "You know what the journal says about the keeper?" Mercer shrugged. "Something about balance." Caleb nodded. "Something about protecting the valley." Mercer laughed quietly. That old man lived in the past. He gestured toward the mountain around them. "The world runs on money now." Caleb thought about that. Then he looked at the lever again. The keeper's notebook had been clear. Once the mountain lock was activated, no one could control the system again. Not Mercer, not Caleb. The mountain would simply release water naturally, fairly, equal for everyone. Mercer watched him closely. "You're not seriously thinking about pulling that?" Caleb didn't answer. Mercer's voice hardened. "You do that, and the system becomes useless." Caleb nodded slightly. "Exactly." Mercer's eyes widened. "You'd destroy a machine like this?" Caleb looked around the massive chamber. The pipes, the tanks, the decades of engineering buried inside the mountain. Then he looked back at Mercer. "No." He shook his head. "I'd protect it." Mercer took another step forward. "You'd throw away the most powerful tool in the valley?" Atlas growled louder. Caleb's voice remained calm. "I'd make sure nobody ever steals from it again." Mercer stopped moving. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across his face. "You don't understand," he said. "I've invested years into this." Caleb nodded. "I believe that." Mercer's voice grew sharp. "And you think you're going to walk in here one day and ruin everything?" Atlas barked again. Caleb kept his eyes on Mercer. "You already ruined everything." Mercer's jaw tightened. For a moment, the two men stood silently in the humming chamber. Then Mercer moved. He lunged forward suddenly, reaching for the console. Atlas reacted instantly. The German shepherd sprang forward with a powerful bark. Mercer jerked backward just in time, as Atlas's teeth snapped inches from his arm. The dog planted himself between Mercer and the control panel, growling. Mercer stumbled back a step. "You should control that animal." Caleb shook his head slowly. "He's doing exactly what he's supposed to." Mercer's eyes burned with anger now. "You have no idea what you're doing." Caleb's hand moved slowly toward the lever. Mercer saw it. "Don't." Caleb didn't stop. The metal handle felt heavy. Mercer took another step forward. "If you pull that lever, you lose everything." Caleb looked at him. "I never had anything." Mercer froze. The words echoed through the chamber. Caleb glanced down at Atlas. The dog's shoulder brushed his leg. Steady. Loyal. Then Caleb looked back at the screen one last time. The valley below glowed blue with flowing water. Small farms. Families. People who would never know his name. But they would drink from the streams tomorrow. Caleb wrapped his fingers around the lever. Mercer's voice cut through the room. "Think carefully, Walker." Caleb nodded. "I am." The mountain hummed. The pipes roared. Atlas stood ready beside him, and the weight of the decision pressed down on Caleb's hand. For a long moment, no one moved. The mountain hummed around them like a living thing. Deep in the rock, pumps turned slowly, pushing thousands of gallons of water through steel arteries that stretched beneath the valley. Mercer watched Caleb's hand tighten around the lever. "You're making a mistake," Mercer said quietly. His voice no longer carried the easy confidence from before. There was tension in it now. Caleb kept his eyes on the control panel. "I've made plenty of those already," he said. Mercer took a slow step forward. "Listen to me, Walker." Atlas immediately shifted his stance, blocking the path. Mercer stopped again, clearly annoyed. "You pull that lever, and everything changes." Caleb nodded. "That's the point." Mercer shook his head. "You think the valley will thank you for this?" Caleb looked toward the glowing map again. The small ranches scattered across the valley floor. Windmills, water towers, dusty roads, cutting through open land. "They won't even know," Caleb said. Mercer frowned. "And that's exactly why you shouldn't do it." He pointed at the screen. "That system allows someone to control the water flow, to protect the valley when drought hits, to manage supply." Caleb slowly turned toward him. "Or to starve people when they don't do what you want." Mercer's jaw tightened. "You don't understand business." Caleb gave a small, tired smile. "No." He looked down at Atlas. "But I understand loyalty." The dog glanced up at him, ears twitching. Mercer scoffed. "This isn't about loyalty. It's about survival." Caleb nodded. "Exactly." He looked back at the lever. His mind drifted for a moment to the orphanage halls. The long nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling. To the sound of helicopters over desert battlefields. To the day Atlas had appeared beside him in the dust of a ruined village, wounded but still guarding his fallen handler. Caleb had saved the dog. But the truth was, Atlas had saved him, too. Mercer's voice cut through the memory. "You're throwing away power most men would kill for." Caleb looked back at him. "That's the problem." The chamber fell silent again. The only sound was the rushing water. Mercer rubbed his face with both hands. "You don't get it," he said. "I've spent 15 years building my ranch." He pointed toward the map again. 15 years. His voice grew sharper. Droughts, floods, bank loans, equipment failures. Caleb listened quietly. Mercer took another breath. And this system, this mountain, this water, his eyes burned with frustration. It could stabilize everything. Caleb shook his head. No. Mercer stared at him. No? He repeated. Caleb nodded slowly. It would make you the king of the valley. Mercer said nothing. The silence confirmed it. Atlas's tail flicked once. Mercer finally spoke again. You don't understand what it takes to build something. Caleb looked around the chamber. Steel pipes older than he was. Massive valves carved into the mountain. Generations of work hidden underground. Oh, Caleb said quietly. I think I do. Mercer frowned. Then why destroy it? Caleb's hand tightened on the lever. I'm not destroying it. He looked Mercer directly in the eyes. I'm freeing it. Mercer's patience finally broke. You self-righteous idiot. He lunged forward. Atlas exploded into motion. The German Shepherd slammed into Mercer's chest before he could reach the console. Both of them crashed to the ground. Mercer shouted in pain as Atlas's weight knocked the air from his lungs. But Mercer reacted fast. He grabbed Atlas's collar and tried to shove the dog away. Atlas snarled. The sound echoed violently through the chamber. Caleb stepped back from the console instinctively. Atlas. The dog didn't release Mercer, but he didn't bite either. He simply pinned the man down, teeth inches from Mercer's throat. Mercer froze. For the first time since entering the mountain, fear showed in his eyes. Caleb stepped closer slowly. Atlas, he said calmly. The dog growled once more, but eased slightly. Still watching Mercer. Mercer lay still on the floor. You trained him well, he muttered. Caleb didn't respond. Mercer slowly raised his hands. All right. He swallowed. Fine. His voice was tight. You win. Caleb studied him carefully. Mercer's breathing was uneven now. You're really going to do it, aren't you? Caleb looked back at the lever. Then he nodded. Yes. Mercer closed his eyes briefly. You're a fool. Caleb shrugged. Maybe. The mountain systems continued humming. The water kept flowing. Atlas slowly backed away from Mercer, but stayed between him and Caleb. Mercer sat up carefully. He didn't try to move again. He just watched. Caleb walked back to the console. The lever weighted. Heavy. Final. He wrapped both hands around it. Mercer's voice came one last time. You pull that, and there's no going back. Caleb nodded. I know. The mountain seemed to hold its breath, and Caleb pulled the lever down. For half a second, nothing happened. The lever moved slowly at first, resisting like it hadn't been touched in decades. The metal groaned against the hinge as Caleb forced it through the last few inches of its arc. Then the system responded. Deep inside the mountain, something enormous shifted. A thunderous metallic boom rolled through the chamber like distant artillery. The floor beneath Caleb's boots trembled slightly. Atlas immediately pressed closer to Caleb's leg. Mercer's head snapped upward. What did you do? He demanded. Caleb kept his eyes on the control console. The screens flickered violently. Rows of warning lights began flashing red across the panel. Somewhere deep beneath them, massive stone gates began sliding into place. The sound was slow, ancient, a grinding roar of steel against rock that echoed through the tunnels like the mountain itself was moving. Mercer scrambled to his feet. No, he said. No, no, no. He rushed toward the console. Atlas leaped forward again, blocking his path with a savage bark. Mercer stopped short. You idiot, Mercer shouted. Caleb finally looked up. Mountain lock, he said quietly. Mercer stared at the flashing console. What does that even mean? Caleb glanced at the keeper's notebook. It means the system just sealed itself. The chamber shook again. A second thunderous slam echoed somewhere far below. Mercer grabbed the edge of the console. You don't understand what you just did. Caleb nodded. I do. The control screens began changing. The glowing map of the valley flickered. The blue lines that represented controlled water flow slowly faded. One by one, the system's control functions shut down. The screen displayed 3 final messages. Manual overrides disabled. External pump integration terminated. Distribution authority revoked. Mercer stared in disbelief. You just destroyed the entire system. Caleb shook his head. No. He pointed toward the map. I released it. The map stabilized. Now, instead of controlled channels, the water system displayed natural flow paths. Springs, underground streams, gravity-fed rivers. The mountain was returning to its original design. Water flowing freely through the valley. Not controlled, not owned. Mercer's face turned pale. You fool. He ran a hand through his hair. All that infrastructure. He pointed at the screen. The pumps, the distribution network. Caleb's voice stayed calm. Still works. Mercer frowned. What? Caleb nodded toward the mountain diagram. The mountain still feeds the valley. He tapped the screen, but nobody controls it anymore. Mercer stared at him. You just gave up the most powerful system in the state? Caleb shrugged slightly. Maybe. Mercer looked around the chamber like a man watching his empire collapse. You don't get it, he whispered. I spent years trying to access this system. Caleb leaned against the console. Why? Mercer laughed bitterly. Why? He pointed toward the ceiling, toward the valley above. Because droughts are coming. Caleb's eyes narrowed. Mercer continued. 10 years from now, water will be worth more than oil. His voice grew louder. And whoever controls it will control everything. Atlas growled softly. Caleb remained quiet. Mercer's shoulders dropped slightly. You could have been rich, he said. Caleb looked at the map again. Farm wells slowly filling, small reservoirs stabilizing. Streams reappearing where they had once run dry. Maybe, Caleb said. Mercer studied him. And you just threw that away. Caleb looked down at Atlas. The dog's ears relaxed slightly now. The tension in his body fading as the system quieted. Caleb scratched behind the dog's ear. I didn't throw it away. Mercer scoffed. What would you call it? Caleb looked back at the valley map. Fair. The mountain gave one last deep mechanical groan. Then the noise stopped. The flashing warning lights faded. The chamber fell quiet. Only the steady sound of water flowing through the pipes remained. Mercer stared at the console. The control systems were now permanently locked. He couldn't override them. No one could. He slowly turned toward Caleb. You've got no idea what kind of enemies you just made. Caleb shrugged. I had worse overseas. Mercer studied him for a long moment. Then he shook his head. You're not built for this world, Walker. Caleb gave a faint smile. Probably not. Mercer walked slowly toward the tunnel entrance. He stopped halfway and looked back. You might have stopped me. His voice was quiet again. But someday, someone else will come looking for this place. Caleb nodded. Maybe. Mercer gave Atlas one last look. The dog's eyes never left him. Then Mercer turned and disappeared into the tunnel. The echo of his footsteps faded into the mountain. Silence returned. Caleb exhaled slowly, and Atlas sat beside him. The violent grinding of the mountain lock had stopped. Warning lights faded to a soft amber glow, leaving only the steady movement of water through the pipes. The chamber no longer sounded like a machine struggling to wake. It sounded peaceful, as if the mountain had finally remembered its own rhythm. The control screens had changed. Rows of commands were gone, replaced by simple readings, spring levels, groundwater pressure, and natural flow routes. The mountain was still alive with water, but no human hand could steer it anymore. Caleb closed the keeper's notebook and rested his palm on its worn cover. "Guess you knew exactly what you were doing," he murmured. Atlas gave a quiet huff. Caleb smiled, placed the notebook back on the desk, and stood. Together, they entered the tunnel, leading to the house above. Their footsteps echoed through the stone corridor, while the chamber hummed softly behind them. Halfway to the surface, Caleb stopped. The metallic slam of the locking gates had stirred memories he had spent years trying to outrun, yet the familiar knot in his chest had begun to loosen. It was not gone. Perhaps it never would be. But Atlas pressed against his leg, warm and steady, and the past retreated a little farther. "Yeah," Caleb whispered, scratching the dog's neck. "I know." They continued toward the light. When Caleb stepped into the mountain house, late afternoon sun poured through the dusty windows. He crossed the room and walked onto the porch, with Atlas beside him. From the ridge, the entire valley opened below weathered barns, scattered ranch houses, grazing cattle, and pale roads winding between fields. At first, nothing seemed different. Then Caleb noticed a silver thread moving through a creek bed that had been dry that morning. Farther down the valley, another stream caught the sunlight. Near an old windmill, a rancher climbed from a pickup and bent over a well pump. The man straightened suddenly, stared at the water in his hands, and turned toward the mountain in disbelief. Caleb understood. The springs were flowing again. "Looks like it worked," he said. Atlas wagged his tail once and settled beside Caleb's boots. Mercer was already somewhere on the road below, carrying his anger away with him. Caleb knew the man might return, and others might eventually search for the secret inside the mountain. But there was no longer a throne to steal. No lever could starve one farm to enrich another. The water would follow gravity, stone, and time, answering to no man. As evening descended, lights appeared in the ranch houses below. Families who would never know Caleb's name gathered behind warm windows. Their wells would fill. Their cattle would drink. Their fields would have another chance. Caleb realized he did not need their gratitude. It was enough to know that tomorrow would be kinder, because he had refused to become what Mercer wanted him to be. He thought of the unknown keeper who had built the final lock and left the house to an orphan. The old man must have understood that power was safest in the hands of someone willing to surrender it. Caleb gave a faint smile. "Guess you were waiting for someone stubborn enough." Atlas thumped his tail against the porch boards. For years after the war, Caleb had moved through temporary jobs, temporary rooms, and temporary lives. He had always felt like a guest in someone else's world. But beneath the stars of the Sawtooth Mountains, with Atlas resting against his knee and living water shining across the valley, that feeling finally began to change. "You stayed with me through everything," Caleb said softly. "Maybe we finally found somewhere worth staying." Atlas sighed and closed his eyes. High above the valley, the old house remained half hidden in the mountain, but it was no longer abandoned. Deep inside the rock, the ancient channels continued carrying water toward farms, homes, and open fields. The system would never belong to one wealthy rancher, one frightened keeper, or one lonely veteran. It belonged to the valley now, and for the first time in his life, Caleb Walker belonged somewhere too. The wind whispered through the pine trees. Atlas slept beside him. Below, the streams kept running, and the mountain kept its promise. Some stories end with a battle. Others end with a victory. But sometimes, the greatest ending is simply finding a place where you finally belong. Do you think Caleb made the right choice when he gave up control of the mountain's water? Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you enjoy stories about veterans, loyal dogs, and ordinary people facing extraordinary choices, subscribe and join us for the next journey.